Yeah, so I guess thanks for the intro and for letting us present. And as you know, as mentioned, we have a smaller group. The last time we did this, we were able to do it in person and try and make it as interactive as possible. So if anyone has questions at any point, please don't feel free just to raise your hand, and we'll do what we can to answer them right away. That being said, what I wanted to do was just a little intro exercise, if that's okay. It always helps to have a better idea of who's kind of listening in. And so maybe if we could get everyone just to briefly do an intro of, what is your company, or what does your company do? And then your current stage of development or funding, if applicable. So just kind of open it up if someone wants to volunteer, and then we'll go from there.
Mihai, do you mind if I have you go first?
Not at all. Hi everyone. Hi, Greta, Shannon, and Darcy. So I'm kind of still getting used to the Zoom features. Just like to say that I was here yesterday. It was a great presentation, and to kind of borrow from what I learned yesterday, I think we could say that we're trying to become a zebra company. I really like that concept, right? Zebra versus unicorn.
That's right.
Long story short, I'm kind of entrepreneur type, but still in a startup stage right now with our project. We had a store. We started a brick and mortar business in Hamilton 5 years ago, which was intended to be a high-tech wellness concept. And because of COVID, we had to shut down. But in the meantime, I decided to pivot to a mobile business concept, and I started building the prototype myself. So I'm kind of like a one-man show at this stage, but I had a lot of interaction with Daniel, and I think we're onto something. Basically, we are trying to build this high-tech mobile business platform to enable entrepreneurs to provide services on demand and on location, given the current trends. So there's a lot to it, but it has a hardware component and a software component. I'm building the hardware, which looks like a really futuristic pod on wheels, which hopefully will have semi-autonomous features. People will call it a trailer, but it doesn't look like a trailer. It's definitely the first ET, or electric trailer, that we're aware of. So anyway, it's a complex project, but we're still in the initial phases. We have a lot of challenges ahead of us, engineering wise, and yeah, so basically that's kind of where we are now.
Sounds very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be happy to share more as we go along, and maybe after this, because I'm just kind of new to the whole process, and Daniel helped me with the business model canvas and all that, and it's been quite exciting. It's something that we want to pursue, and we'll see how much we can cooperate with the Innovation Factory and where it goes from there.
Excellent.
Christopher Trafford. Hello, sir. How are you? Can I have you go next?
I was just going to listen in and see what was going on. How are you?
Good.
We're a digital fundraising company for nonprofits and other community groups. We just launched our MVP. We're onboarding our first live customers. Yeah, we've raised about $500,000, most of it in non-dilutive government grants and guaranteed loans.
Very good.
And Manar.
Hello and good morning, everyone. My name is Manar Said, and my husband and I are starting a company to introduce a new idea for air conditioning. We are still in the prototype stage, and we are looking forward to learn a lot more about how to start a business. And that's it.
Okay.
Perfect. Who do I have left here? I see someone's called in. Would you, can you introduce yourself? Nope. Okay, might be difficult from the phone. And Joshua? Nope, we have some shy folks on the line today. Okay, well, you've got a little bit of a sense of who got on here, so I'll pass it back over to you.
No, that sounds great, and it always helps. It sounds like varying stages of companies, and some that are a little bit further along, some that are getting started, and so hopefully there's some good content in here that can help. And as mentioned, feel free to ask questions as we go. So just a very brief overview of who we are. We're a software development firm based in Mississauga, and we help customers with firmware development, cloud and apps, data and analytics. And you know, it can be oftentimes very early stage where it's just a little bit of help getting started, helping with rapid prototyping all the way through, you know, full scale commercialization. So definitely don't want this to be a product pitch about us. It's just a brief intro, and looking forward to talking about a big part of how we've been able to help a lot of these companies to get funded by having a really strong plan in place. So to get started on the presentation content, you know, just even hearing a couple of you introduce your businesses and what you're looking to do, there's so many awesome ideas out there, and we're lucky to get to hear so many of them because we talk to a lot of different companies. It could be, you know, groundbreaking new technology, just disrupting a business model. There's so many different ways that it can happen, and so it's very exciting, obviously. If you've done this before, you'll kind of understand a bit more about the resources, the time, and the planning, everything it takes to turn it into reality. But if not, it's a lot of unknowns, and hopefully we can help share a bit of detail on that. So one of the goals that we're trying to do in this presentation is just share some of the key steps that we really want to make sure that you're aware of, because if you can do that and you've got a great idea, you've got a strong team, and you've got a really good plan, it's just going to really help with a successful outcome. So in terms of the goals of the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about how a product roadmap and the development plan impacts funding. It's not the only thing that you need, but it is one of the things that is going to definitely help. Share some of the common issues or challenges or mistakes that we've seen made in the process. And then as part of that, you know, looking at kind of the why you would need it, some of the mistakes that or challenges, give you a list of questions that you can ask and kind of a takeaway that you could do on your own. So what are the right questions to ask? How do you go about creating kind of an estimate, a development estimate, a backlog, to do prioritization, and then figure out, you know, what level of funding you're going to need and where you should maybe look. Some of the things that we're definitely not going to cover as part of the presentation, you know, how to validate your idea. So that's more the product market research or product market fit. We do love talking about that. It's just that's not, you know, part of what we're going to do today. In addition, how to create a business plan, how to build and hire a team, specific technology solutions, and then I like talking about sports, but we'll keep that out of today's presentation. So just, you know, why a roadmap and plan? And I think really it comes down to being able to answer a lot of these questions. And, you know, if you haven't went through the exercise and you can't answer these questions, then you can definitely get tripped up at different stages of developing. So what is the product and what problem does it solve? It sounds obvious, but just being very clear in what it is, what it solves, because that will help guide things like what is core, what do you really need to have versus what would be nice to have. And, you know, in these early stages, that is one of the common mistakes that we do see is everything is critical, everything is required. But if you really understand what the problem, what the product is and the problem that it solves, then you can be better at filtering out what's core versus nice to have. It also helps to know, you know, are you in the beta phase, the MVP, or is this a scaled solution? What resources you're going to need to help build it? That could be contract manufacturing, it could be hardware design, software design, infrastructure. So just understand all those different pieces. And then definitely when you get into more of the funding conversation, you're typically going to be asked for timelines, for estimates, and having all that ready to go is going to make a much stronger presentation when going for funding. So some of the types of funding that we're often working together with companies like yours on is how to apply for research type funding, universities or government. Then it typically migrates into more of the seed funding. So this could be accelerators. Sometimes it's winning competitions. I know there's the Lions Lair competition that would be an example. Family and friends, as well as other options. And then as you continue to scale and you go more for the commercialization side, some of the sources to look at: IRAP, FedDev. There might be high net worth individuals that you know, and even VCs will get into the commercialization funding if you're looking at doing more of a Series A to start. And then obviously on the scale up side, that gets more into VCs, private equity, potentially even IPO. So just understanding again that stage of where you're at will really help in terms of what type of funding to go after, and just want to kind of share some of those different groups. So in terms of funding due diligence, after you kind of have an idea of where you think you fit in those buckets, there's always going to be some form of due diligence that happens, no matter whether it's applying for a grant all the way to a VC. And so some of the key things they're going to be looking at, obviously understanding the business plan, the business model. If there's an investment being made, whether it's going to result in jobs being created or revenue or whatever it may be, there is that business plan that's part of it. Beyond that, where we're focused a bit more with this presentation is there is going to be an evaluation of your ability to execute. They're going to want to know that you have the right team and the right resources. And one way they do that is just, do you have a plan in place for how you're going to get from where you are now to those critical first milestones? And as part of that, obviously, if you're asking for money, then there's got to be a very clear use of funds. So where is that money going to be spent? It's not all necessarily on development. It could be on sales, marketing, legal, other areas, but having that very clearly laid out, as well as what you're going to need to get from where you are now to that next milestone, is so important. I think one of the things that we see a lot of investors, whether it's government all the way through VCs, where they get concerned is if you only have enough money to get halfway. And so it's very important to really know what is it going to take to not just get partway there, but to get all the way to that next critical milestone where maybe you have to raise more, or maybe you're now at a point where you're generating enough revenue that you can start to finance things on your own. So when really focusing on that, that the product and the features, some of the common challenges and mistakes that we see, I already referenced this, but too many features in the initial product. And this is the concept that everything is important. And so, really challenging that is going to be a necessary piece. It's what is absolutely necessary and everything else should or can wait. The next thing is wrong features in the initial product. If you don't have that validation that you know exactly what's needed, we always push to just test it, to get something quickly out there so you can really get that feedback and confirm what truly needs to be in the product versus not. Especially now with mobile and technology, if you don't have hardware, this is a bit easier because you can quickly whip up some mock-ups or a prototype, get that feedback, but you just really want to make sure you're building the right thing. The next common challenge that we see is oftentimes around scale of the solution. Early on, you don't need to build something that can support millions of users. If it is something that's going to go viral, that's great. But if you've got hardware or you've got installation or something that takes time to onboard, you can start with a smaller solution, a simpler solution. And then as you've proven the market, invest in upgrading and making it much more scalable. Some other pieces, just, when you're building a product, especially if it's hardware and software, there's a lot of different skill sets required. And oftentimes early on you can do that all yourself, but over time you're probably going to need to hire or find other people that can help. And so that's just part of the plan, is to also recognize with the work being done, who can do it. And then, finally, if you're going for funding and you don't have a timeline, you don't have a budget, obviously that's not going to work. And so we're going to try and share some bit more info on, the approach that we take to help work through this. Any initial questions before we jump into kind of the 7 steps that we've outlined?
No, I think we are good.
Okay, we'll keep going. All right, so the first step, and whether this is us working with someone or someone doing this on their own, we always recommend just stop, to pause for a moment, and to review the inputs and understand, okay, where are you now? What's already done? And this would include what work's already been completed. Do you have prototypes that you've created? Have you done customer interviews? What have you actually got so far? As part of that also, then how is the product going to be used? What is the end user look like? How would they install this? How would they configure it? Do they have time constraints? Is there accessibility constraints? Just understanding the end user and all the potential limitations around that. And then moving beyond that would be, the product or technology limitations. So we oftentimes see prototypes, which are, they're fairly close in terms of being able to demonstrate what it needs, but there's certain technology pieces that just aren't there yet. And so, if the technology is not there, then there may be a different approach that you have to take. And then finally would be that, reviewing the future expansion capabilities. Where do you think you may want to go? And the goal of this, again, is it's a bit of a sanity check on just where you are. And we are, I think if you do this all internally, just yourself, it can be a bit dangerous. So what we say is, take all those inputs and share it with someone else. It could be a colleague, it could be an advisor, it could be a mentor. There's a number of different people, but just taking all these details and presenting it, because oftentimes when you present where you're at, it's very obvious that there's pieces missing, there's assumptions that you're making that are incorrect. And so there is a common theme that we have in this early stage of organizing and presenting back. And if it sounds good and it makes sense, there's a good chance that you're on the right path. And so we highly recommend that sanity step. The next thing that we do or recommend is, de-risking the unknowns. So, unless you're doing something very simple that's been done many, many times before, there's probably some unknowns that you have, and those could be business unknowns, they could be technology unknowns. And so we want to really identify them, be critical of them, and challenge them. This could be, if there's some proprietary algorithm or technology that you're building. It's one thing to work in a lab environment, but now you're building this in a product where someone else is running it. Does that all of a sudden break? Can it, can you deploy thousands of these and it's still going to work, or is it still just not quite there yet? And we do see quite a lot of this where, it could be a MATLAB algorithm. It could be something that works on research data, but all of a sudden you give it a brand new data set and it starts to fail. The next thing is the operating environment. I kind of touched on this before. If you're the only one using and interacting with this prototype, you could be missing a lot of unknowns around the end user or their environment or how they would look at it. And so not only the environment, but getting that customer feedback, make sure very, very early on, before you finish just defining everything that you're going to need to build, that you've got some feedback, some independent feedback to really challenge those assumptions. We also recommend, depending on what you're doing at this early stage, that you've done some form of user experience or UI UX review, and it really all fits into that same thing. You're looking at how your typical user would interact with this device or software to know what's going to be easy for them and what's not, because that will have an impact on whether or not adoption happens. And then one of the decision points that we typically have is, are you ready to do your MVP, or would it make a lot more sense to build a prototype or a proof of concept so you can completely de-risk all these things? Some of the biggest success stories that we have from companies we work with were exactly that. They did a real quick and dirty prototype, and they went and they installed it, and they saw how customers used it, and they realized quite quickly that they had gotten most of it right, but there's some key things that were missing. And so then taking that input into the plan for an MVP resulted in a much more successful and ultimately faster path from start to commercialization. So we're now making the assumption that, we know our starting point, we know where we're at. We have we really de-risked the unknowns. We understand what the product needs to do, what it can do, the customer requirements. So this is where we still don't want to just go and build everything. We're looking at, okay, what is the bare minimum, the absolute least number of features that we can build into this product to allow, for customers to want to buy it, for companies to want to buy it. This is not about, it's hard because it's your idea. So it has to be less about you and your idea and just all about what customers really need. So we really challenge this, going through the overall features, and is it truly core or is it nice to have? We also do, along with challenging this, the flip side would be that we want to take a look at features and understand what is easy to do now and easy to do later. There may be, especially when you're working with hardware, there may be some nice to have features that you just can't add later. And in that case, okay, those are something that we would recommend to include as part of an MVP. But if it's easy to add later and it's a nice to have, definitely push back on it. The final piece of this concept is also product upgrades. On the software side of things, this tends to be quite a lot easier to push out a new software update. On the hardware side, obviously a bit more challenging because you may have to do a product recall. But just to have thought about how that would happen, and if you keep your feature set smaller and you have the ability to upgrade, can be a great way of getting something to market fast and then incrementally providing additional features over time. So now that we've narrowed in on our MVP and what we believe is core, and we have a kind of upgrade strategy planned out, we always want to take a look at the other criteria. This is independent of a specific product feature, but it can have a huge impact if it's overlooked. So once again, these are some of the questions that we're looking to ask and have clarity on before we really get going. So scale. How many installations or systems or devices or users do we need to support? Is it in the tens? Is it in the 10,000s? Is it more? And also kind of over what time frame? We're looking at hundreds within the first 2 years, and then we're looking at thousands within 5 years, or is it going to scale much faster, much quicker? This is obviously a bit of guesstimation in here, but understanding what you think and kind of having some validation around it helps you not either underbuild or overbuild that initial deployment. The next one is security. If you're dealing with, especially if you're dealing with any type of personal information, whether it's health information, addresses, you name it, people will expect that it's going to be protected. And the level of security that you implement will definitely scale based on the sensitivity of the information that's collected. If you have a product that doesn't need to collect any information, maybe this is just kind of a very simple baseline, but it is important to understand what that is, because if you didn't think about it and you have to go fix it after the fact, it can be a lot more expensive. On the regulatory side, a lot of customers that we work with are in regulated industries, in energy, and in medical. There's others that we work with, and if you are in one of those industries, it's important to understand what the requirements are, because if you do it up front, it can be a pretty low cost, but if you have to go back and fix it, it's definitely going to delay things, and it could be quite a bit of rework that comes with it. Other things to think of: localization. So if you're focusing in Ontario or in the US, maybe English is fine. If you're looking at going Canada-wide, you have to support multiple languages, and so just understanding where the target is so that you can figure out when and if that has an impact will be important. And then again, we've talked about operating environment, but any physical constraints, hardware constraints. So these are really all independent from what your product does, but you really need to understand what they are and their impact and include that as your plan, because if you're asked questions on it, it's going to make you look like you've really done your homework, and a much better bet to receive that funding. So up to this point, it's been a lot of planning and asking questions and challenging assumptions, and now we get to do a bit more of maybe the exciting part, which is working on planning how the solution is going to be built. So this is taking a look at, okay, what technical components are there in the system? Is there hardware? Is there firmware? Is it a mobile app? Is there a cloud interface, analytics, right? All the different components of it. And just to kind of break it down and say, okay, these are all the pieces that we need to build. Next, we want to then go and see, our goal is always to use existing technology wherever possible. There's so many great hardware platforms, software frameworks, infrastructure, tools, you name it out there, that there's a lot that can be done without having to do custom design or write custom code. And so we want to take a look at all those things, because the more of them you can use, the faster you'll get there, the less it's going to cost for the most part, and maintenance is hopefully going to be simpler as well. With those two things understood, then from our side, we recommend you're going to have to look at what custom code is going to need to be written. How are all these pieces going to fit together? The open source tools, the infrastructure, the development environments, how are they all going to fit together? And then perhaps most importantly, not skipping the step of what it's actually going to look like. Having user mock-ups, having hardware mock-ups, having wireframes that show how installation, setup, configuration, how all those things are done, because that will have a significant impact on potentially the technologies that are needed, as well as some of the code that's going to be written. So with the previous one, starting to look at all those different outputs that are needed, some of the documents that we typically recommend that you create, and these don't have to be complex templates. They can be simple bullet points in a Word document. It could be an Excel spreadsheet that just lists these things out. But we do recommend that you're doing all this work, that you take it and you put it into some type of actual document or storage repo. On our side, we oftentimes use Excel and Word early on, and then we'll migrate into using Jira and Confluence and other better task tracking type applications. But some of the things that we want to make sure exist, it's that high level product specification. It's really a document describing what it is that you're planning to build and some of the key features that go with it. The next is kind of the high level proposed technical solution. So this is how it's going to be built. It could be kind of high level hardware schematics. It could be software architecture diagrams that show, we've got mobile, we've got cloud, we've got an embedded device. How do they communicate together? Where is data stored? So just some details around that. Again, if you're not technical, it doesn't have to be super specific, but understanding those main components is going to be a big part of it. The next then is migrating more from what's going to be built and how it's built into the execution side. So, on our side, we do agile-based development. And the reason we do that is because we want to, every sprint have a, initial release or deliverable that we could potentially show to customers, to show to stakeholders, and to get that feedback, because we understand even with the perfect plan, requirements do change. And so being able to work in that agile manner really helps. And so kind of planning out how you're going to execute the project and what release or demo points you can have as part of that plan and roadmap will be very helpful. And then taking all these product specifications, the technical requirements, and converting it into a backlog is another piece that's going to be very, very helpful in creating that plan. So the backlog is all the different tasks that you will need to do to complete the current development phase that you're at. This could be setup tasks, it could be design tasks, it could be development, testing, you name it. But having them all list out is the first step, and then prioritizing them in order of your must-haves into your really nice-to-haves. And then with that, assigning some form of time or cost to each one of those. It's a very much it's a very, very thorough way of getting a strong initial time and cost estimate, where you've also then broken it up into kind of the phases for how you're looking at approaching it. So the final step of this, we're now at the point where, as mentioned, we've reviewed the inputs, we've challenged the unknowns, we've created some of the draft inputs, and we now have some base, not extremely detailed, but high level documents in place around the product spec, the architecture, a backlog that's been prioritized and estimated. At this point, again, if you've been doing a lot of this on your own, you're definitely going to want to do some review. Have you gotten feedback from mentors and key stakeholders? Have you gotten feedback from customers, from the end users? Those validation points are very, very important to say, okay, here's what we're building. Here's what the first release is going to look like. Does this make sense? Does this look good? Have you looked at having someone that you can bounce off of? Okay, are we using the right technologies? Are we writing code that we really don't need to? Would it be simpler if we did? Do we really need a mobile app, or could we just have a responsive web interface that you can view on a mobile device? So it's just challenging the overall plan with trusted advisors. And then the final one we always say is, is there room in the budget to react to requirements that almost always will change? We're not trying to be perfect right now. We're just trying to get enough information that we have a very reasonable plan and that we have some ability to respond to changes as they come, because almost always happens as you're doing these development projects. And then the theme we talked about presenting your plan. So to be honest, at every single step that we just went over, we would say present it, talk to someone, especially if you're doing it on your own. Practice with team members, advisors, collaborators. And I think there's a lot of times when you're explaining your idea to someone and how you're going to execute it, that you can tell, what, this is good. Or you're like, wait a second, I couldn't really explain that properly. And if you can't explain it properly, or it doesn't make sense, or you're finding that people are over and over, saying the same thing, I think you've missed this. You recognize those cues, and if you have to go back and do an iteration or de-risk an unknown or figure it out, that's okay. And by practicing this, by the time you do get to the point of presenting to investors or applying for funding, you're going to come across as not only having a great idea, but the competence of really knowing what you're doing, having data to back it up. It's such a massive difference in how that first impression is when you're talking to someone externally, because that's a big part of what they have to go on, is how well you can present answer their questions and challenges. So just to kind of wrap it up, I think, you know, the goal here is, I'm hoping to simplify that thought process of going from, you know, a great idea into a really strong plan. And, you know, a lot of it is hopefully kind of common sense and intuitive, but we found, and we'll share a success story after here, but we found that in going through those steps and, you know, each one of them, by doing that, when we do get to the point of looking for funding, it really does help. So it's not skipping the planning, but also introducing prototyping into it. And the goal is that when you have all those pieces together, that's not only will you get the funding, but the journey to commercialize will be a lot smoother and a lot more successful. So I had a quick success story that I want to share, and then definitely open it up for any questions. So one of the companies that we did this exact process with was a company called Vox Neuro. They're in Hamilton. I believe they actually were part of the Innovation Factory at one point.
Yep,
And,
for sure.
Yeah, so they first came to us and they had done some initial research. They had an idea for a product that they want to build, but they really weren't sure on what technology, how long it was going to take, how much it would cost. And so we did a discovery and design iteration with them. And we went through the 7 steps that we just talked about, to the point where we had a really strong plan, a product specification, we had a backlog, we had estimates, and they took all that input and they went to IRAP and were able to successfully get funding, which was needed to do the initial commercialization. And they are continuing to it's a fantastic success story. They've got a great team, a really cool idea, and they just needed a bit of help on the plan side. And you know, they're in the medical industry, they're almost done FDA approvals, and they're really at that point where they're about to start to scale. So it's a huge success story where, you know, be able to work with someone and ask all the right questions, create that really strong plan, and then just watch them take off from there. So it's, you know, having a good plan takes something that's unknown and can be scary, and it makes it simple. And we believe this does, and hopefully there's some helpful information in there.